When my 3-year-old son pointed at me during family dinner, he said, "Grandma told me Mama is a witch who stole Daddy." "What did Grandma tell you?" I asked while my mother-in-law Janet sat there smiling like she'd won something. My husband Craig dropped his fork and our son Oliver kept pointing at me. "She said you use magic to make Daddy stay, and witches are bad." Oliver's voice was loud and clear in front of Craig's entire family at Thanksgiving. 23 relatives all stopped eating to stare at us. Janet took a sip of wine and acted shocked. "Oliver, sweetie, you weren't supposed to tell the secret." She said it like she was scolding him, but her eyes were laughing. Craig stood up, angry. "Mom, what the hell did you say to him?" But Janet was already in performance mode. "I didn't say anything inappropriate. Children have such imaginations." She turned to Craig's Aunt Dorothy. "You know how 3-year-olds make things up." But Oliver wasn't done. "Grandma said Mama put a spell on you at college." He was looking at Craig now. "She said real mommies don't work and leave their babies." I'd gone back to my accounting job 6 months ago after maternity leave, and Janet had been furious about it. She said witches wear black clothes and Mama always wears black. I was wearing a black dress because it was slimming and professional. Craig picked up Oliver. "When did Grandma say these things, buddy?" Oliver played with Craig's collar while answering. "Every day when she watches me. She said Mama will fly away on her broom soon." Janet had been babysitting 3 days a week while I worked and Craig traveled for business. "She reads me the witch book." Craig's sister Lauren suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Mom, you didn't read him that old German fairy tale book, did you? The one where the evil stepmother is burned as a witch at the end." Janet shrugged. "It's educational. Children need to learn about good and evil." She looked right at me. "And Oliver needs to know who really loves him." Craig's dad, Robert, finally spoke up. "Janet, that's enough. You're poisoning our grandson against his mother." But Janet wasn't backing down. "Someone needs to tell the truth in this family." She stood up and walked over to Oliver. "Tell them what else Grandma taught you, sweetie." Oliver looked confused but recited like he'd memorized it. "Real grandmas get to see their grandkids every day. But witch mamas send grandmas away? Now I understand. This was about me refusing to let her move in with us last month." Craig handed Oliver to his cousin and turned on his mother. "You've been training him to hate his mother because we won't let you live with us?" Janet's face went red. "I raised you better than to abandon your mother for some woman." "Some woman. We'd been married for 5 years. She's my wife and Oliver's mother." Craig was getting louder. "And you're teaching our son she's evil?" Lauren pulled out her phone. "Mom, you sent me videos of Oliver saying this stuff. You thought it was funny." She showed Craig the screen. "Look, there's 12 videos over the past month." In the videos, Janet was coaching Oliver to repeat worse and worse things. "Say Mama is mean. Say Mama doesn't love you. Say you want to live with Grandma." Oliver's little voice repeated everything for treats and toys. Craig watched with his face getting darker. "You bribed our son to say horrible things about his mother." Janet grabbed Oliver from Craig's cousin. "He needs to know the truth. That you married beneath you." She bounced Oliver on her hip. "Tell Daddy what Grandma promised you." Oliver smiled big. "Grandma said if Mama goes away, I get a puppy and my own room at her house." The whole table gasped. Craig's grandmother, Helen, who was 90, stood up shaking. "Janet Marie, you're sick in the head." She walked over with her cane. "Teaching a baby to reject his mother? You're the witch here." Janet backed away, still holding Oliver. "I'm protecting him from a mother who prioritizes career over family." I'd had enough. "I work 25 hours a week. You're the one who abandoned Craig for your career when he was young." That was the family secret nobody mentioned. Janet had left Craig with Robert when she went to law school and didn't come back for 3 years. That was different. I was building a future. She was getting desperate now. "You're just a bookkeeper who thinks she's important." Craig's Uncle Paul laughed bitter. "Janet, you missed Craig's first words, first steps, and first day of school. He'd helped raise Craig during those years. But sure lecture his wife about working part-time." Robert walked over to Janet. "Give me my grandson right now." His voice was steel. "You're never babysitting again." Janet held Oliver tighter. "You can't take him from me. I have grandparent rights." But Robert had already pulled out his phone. He pressed the phone to his ear and his voice came out steady and clear. "Isaac, this is Robert Bartlett. I need emergency legal consultation about grandparent rights and parental alienation." Janet's eyes went wide and she stepped backward while still gripping Oliver against her chest. The dining room had gone completely silent except for Robert's voice explaining the situation to whoever was on the other end. "My wife has been coaching our 3-year-old grandson to reject his mother. We have video evidence. 12 separate instances over the past month." Craig moved toward his mother with his hands out. Janet turned away from him and held Oliver tighter. "You can't take him from me." "Tell them, Craig." But Craig reached around her and pulled Oliver out of her arms despite her trying to twist away. Oliver's face scrunched up and he started crying. "Why is everyone mad at Grandma?" His little voice was confused and scared. Did I do something bad? I wanted to grab him and hold him, but Craig had him now. My baby looked at all the angry adult faces around the table, and I felt rage burning through my chest at what Janet had done to him. She'd put him in the middle of adult problems he couldn't understand. She'd made him a weapon against his own mother. Oliver kept crying and asking what was wrong, and nobody knew how to explain it to a 3-year-old. Craig bounced him and tried to calm him down, but Oliver was getting more upset. Lauren stood up and walked over to us with her phone. You need to see all of them, not just the one I showed you. She held the screen out, and Craig shifted Oliver to one arm so he could look. Janet lunged forward and tried to grab the phone. Don't you dare. Those are private. Lauren pulled back and held the phone away from her mother. Private? You sent them to me. You thought they were funny. I moved next to Craig and looked at the screen while Lauren scrolled through the videos. The first one showed Janet's living room with Oliver sitting on her couch. Say Mama is mean. Janet's voice came from behind the camera. Oliver repeated it, and Janet gave him a cookie. The second video showed the same setup. Say Mama doesn't love you. Oliver said it, and Janet handed him a small toy car. The third video made my stomach hurt. Say you want to live with Grandma. Oliver repeated it perfectly, and Janet clapped her hands. There were 12 videos total, and each one got worse. Craig's face went white as paper while he watched his mother bribe our son. In video 7, Oliver said, Mama doesn't love you like Grandma does, and Janet rewarded him with a whole handful of candy. Craig's hands started shaking. Janet was yelling now. You're taking everything out of context. I was just playing games with him. But the videos had timestamps showing they happened during every single babysitting session over the past month, 3 times a week for 4 weeks. 12 separate coaching sessions where she trained our son to hate me. This is sick. Craig's voice came out rough and angry. You bribed him. You literally bribed our 3-year-old to say horrible things about his mother. Janet grabbed at the phone again, but Lauren stepped back. Mom, stop it. Everyone can see what you did. The whole family was watching now. Craig's aunts and uncles and cousins all staring at the phone screen as Lauren held it up. Video 9 showed Oliver getting a stuffed puppy after saying, Grandma loves me more than Mama does. Video 10 showed him getting a new book after saying, Mama is bad. Video 11 showed cookies and juice after, I want Grandma, not Mama. Video 12 was the worst because Oliver looked right at the camera and smiled while saying, if Mama goes away, I get to live with Grandma forever. Robert finished his phone call and walked over to Janet. His face looked like stone. Isaac McMillan is a family lawyer who handles grandparent rights cases. He said what you've done is called parental alienation and it's serious. Janet backed away from him. I didn't do anything wrong. I was protecting Oliver. Robert shook his head. You're staying at a hotel tonight. You're not welcome in my home after this. The shock on Janet's face was real. She actually looked surprised that her husband was taking our side. You're choosing them over me? Your own wife? Robert's voice stayed calm but hard. I'm choosing my grandson over your manipulation. Pack a bag. You're leaving tonight. Janet started crying. Loud sobbing that sounded fake even though tears were running down her face. My whole family is abandoning me. Everyone is turning against me. She looked around the table at all the relatives. Can't you see what she's done? She's turned all of you against me. Helen stood up from her chair at the end of the table. She was Craig's grandmother and she was 90 years old, but her voice came out strong. Stop with the victim act, Janet. We all saw what you did. We watched those videos. She pointed her cane at Janet. You coached a baby to reject his mother. You bribed him with treats and toys. You manipulated an innocent child for your own selfish reasons. Helen's hand was shaking on her cane, but she kept going. What you did is evil. Pure evil. And you're trying to play victim now like you didn't do anything wrong. Janet wiped her eyes and tried to look hurt. I only wanted what was best for Oliver. His mother works all the time and leaves him. But nobody was buying it anymore. Craig shifted Oliver to his other arm and looked at his mother. We're leaving. Don't contact us. Don't come to our house. Don't try to see Oliver. Janet reached out toward them. You can't keep me from my grandson. Craig turned away and started walking toward the front door. I followed him and grabbed my purse from the side table. Behind us, I heard chairs scraping and footsteps. Half the family was following us out. Lauren caught up first and hugged me in the front hallway. I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner. Craig's Aunt Natasha was right behind her. She put her arms around me and whispered close to my ear. I never trusted how sweet she acted with Oliver. It always felt like she was performing, like it was too much. More relatives crowded into the hallway apologizing and offering support. Craig's uncle Roman said he'd testify about anything we needed. His cousin Michelle said she'd seen Janet acting strange with Oliver at the last family party, but hadn't known what to make of it. We pushed through to the front door and walked out into the cold November night. The driveway was full of cars and half the family had followed us outside. Oliver had stopped crying and was looking around at everyone with big, confused eyes. Craig carried him to our car and I opened the back door to buckle him into his car seat. Oliver went in without fighting and I strapped him in carefully. His little face looked so tired and confused. By the time I closed the door, he was already falling asleep. Craig got in the driver's seat and I got in passenger side. He started the car and backed out of the driveway while relatives waved from the lawn. We drove for maybe 10 minutes before Craig pulled over into a parking lot. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, so hard his knuckles were white. Then he started crying. Not quiet tears, but loud sobbing that shook his whole body. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder. He cried for 5 minutes straight while I sat there not knowing what to say. "I'm sorry." His voice came out broken between sobs. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I left him alone with her. I made excuses for her my whole life." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "She did this to our son, and I didn't protect him." I squeezed his shoulder. "We'll fix it. We'll help him." Craig pulled back onto the road, but 10 minutes later he had to pull over again because he was crying too hard to see. We sat in another parking lot while he apologized over and over. For not seeing what his mother was doing. For leaving Oliver with her. For defending her behavior for years. For bringing her toxicity into our family. We finally got home at almost midnight. Oliver was still asleep in his car seat. Craig carried him inside and up to his bedroom while I followed with our coats. We changed Oliver into his pajamas without waking him up and tucked him into bed. His little face looked peaceful and innocent. Like he had no idea what had happened tonight. Craig and I went downstairs to the living room and sat on the couch. We talked for hours about everything. About Janet's behavior over the years. About how she'd acted when Craig and I first started dating. About how angry she'd been when I went back to work. Craig told me stories about his childhood that he'd never really talked about before. How Janet had left when he was 5 to go to law school in another state. How she'd only come home for holidays and summers for 3 years. How his dad and Uncle Roman had raised him during that time. How when she finally came back, she'd acted like nothing had happened. Like abandoning her son for 3 years was totally normal. He told me about being 7 years old and asking why his mommy didn't love him enough to stay. About how she'd told him she loved him but had important things to do. About how he'd learned to accept whatever scraps of attention she gave him and be grateful for them. About how he'd spent his whole life making excuses for her, because that was easier than admitting his mother had chosen her career over him. I started understanding how Janet's abandonment had trained Craig to accept her cruelty as normal mother behavior. How he'd learned to minimize her toxic actions because facing the truth was too painful. We talked until 3 in the morning. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Oliver and all the damage Janet had done in just 1 month. The next morning, I heard Oliver's voice from his bedroom. "Mama? Daddy?" I got up and went to his room. He was standing in his crib looking at me with sleepy eyes. "Is Grandma coming today?" My chest felt tight. I lifted him out of the crib and held him. "No, sweetie. Grandma won't be babysitting anymore." Oliver's face crumpled. "But I want to see Grandma. She promised me a puppy." He started crying and pushing against me. "I want Grandma. She said I could have a puppy in my own room at her house." I sat down in the rocking chair with him, but he kept squirming and crying. "Grandma loves me. Why can't I see her?" I tried to explain that Grandma had made some mistakes, but Oliver was 3 years old, and all he understood was that the person who gave him treats and toys and promises was gone. He cried for 20 minutes. When Craig came in to help, Oliver pushed him away too. "You made Grandma leave. You were mean to her." I realized then that the process of fixing what Janet had done was going to be so much harder than I'd thought. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep Oliver busy with his toys, while my mind kept going back to Janet's face at that table. Craig stayed in our bedroom making phone calls to family members, and I could hear his voice getting louder each time. Oliver asked me 3 more times when Grandma was coming, and each time I had to tell him she wasn't. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard Robert's voice. He told me he'd met with a family lawyer that morning named Isaac McMillan who handled grandparent rights cases. My stomach dropped because I hadn't even thought about Janet having legal options. Robert said Isaac wanted to meet with us today if possible, because Janet had spent her morning researching visitation rights and had already texted him about filing a petition. I called Craig into the room and put Robert on speaker. Craig's face went pale as his dad explained that Janet was serious about taking legal action. Robert gave us Isaac's office address and said he'd already told the lawyer we'd probably call. I hung up and looked at Craig, who was staring at the wall. We got Oliver dressed in clean clothes and drove to Isaac's office, which was in a building downtown near the courthouse. The waiting room had boring magazines and a fish tank that Oliver pressed his face against while we checked in with the receptionist. Isaac came out after 10 minutes, and he was younger than I expected, with glasses and a kind smile. He shook our hands and led us back to his office while a paralegal took Oliver to a playroom down the hall. Isaac's office had law books covering 2 walls and family photos on his desk. He sat down and pulled out a yellow legal pad. He explained that our state does allow grandparents to petition for visitation rights, but that parental alienation evidence works strongly in our favor. I felt a tiny bit of relief hearing that. Craig pulled out his phone and showed Isaac the videos Lauren had sent him. Isaac watched all 12 clips with his expression getting more serious. He said the videos were damaging proof of Janet's manipulation and would help our case significantly. But he also said we'd need more documentation of Oliver's behavioral changes to show the full extent of what she'd done. He asked if we'd noticed any changes in Oliver's behavior toward me over the past few months. I told him about Oliver pulling away from me sometimes and repeating phrases that sounded coached. Craig mentioned how Oliver had started asking why I had to work instead of staying home like other mommies. Isaac wrote everything down and then looked up at us. He said we needed to start Oliver in therapy immediately with someone who specialized in parental alienation cases. He knew a child psychologist named Adriana McMillan who could document Oliver's statements and progress. Isaac said Adriana's professional assessment would be crucial if Janet actually filed a court petition. He called her office right there and got us an appointment for that same afternoon at 5. I felt overwhelmed by how fast everything was moving. Isaac went over what would happen if Janet filed her petition and explained the court process. He said most judges take parental alienation very seriously, especially when there's video evidence. We left his office with a folder of documents and information about what to expect. Oliver ran back to us from the playroom covered in marker on his hands. We drove across town to Adriana's office, which was in a small professional building with a playground visible from the parking lot. The waiting room had toys scattered everywhere and children's artwork on the walls. Adriana came out to meet us, and she had warm brown eyes and spoke softly. She knelt down to Oliver's level and asked if he wanted to play with some toys, while Mommy and Daddy talked to her. Oliver looked uncertain, but followed her into a room filled with dolls and action figures and building blocks. Craig and I sat in her office while she explained her approach. She said she specialized in helping children separate truth from coaching in cases like ours. She asked detailed questions about Janet's relationship with Oliver and what specific things he'd been saying. I told her about the witch comments and the phrases about me not loving him. Adriana nodded like she'd heard this before. She warned us that Oliver might resist therapy at first because Janet had made their special time together feel like love and treats. She said children often don't understand they're being manipulated because the manipulation comes wrapped in affection. After 30 minutes, she brought Oliver back and said she'd like to see him twice a week for the next month. Oliver was quiet on the drive home and fell asleep before we got there. Craig carried him inside and put him in bed still in his clothes. We sat on the couch exhausted, and neither of us knew what to say. Around 8 that night, Craig's phone buzzed with a text message. He looked at the screen and his face changed. He showed me the message from Janet. It was long and called me manipulative and claimed I'd turned his whole family against her. She said she'd only ever tried to protect Oliver from a mother who prioritizes career over family. The message said history would prove her right, and that she wouldn't stop fighting for her grandson. Craig's hands were shaking as he held the phone. I watched him type out a response and then delete it. He did this over and over for 20 minutes trying to find the right words. Finally, he just stared at the screen and then blocked her number. His whole body was shaking as he did it. I realized this was probably the first time in his entire life he'd ever set a real boundary with his mother. He put the phone down and put his head in his hands. I moved closer and put my arm around him but didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. The next morning, I got ready for work and dropped Oliver at Robert's house since he'd offered to watch him for the day. My boss called me around 10, and I could tell from her voice something was wrong. She said Janet had somehow gotten our office number and had spent 30 minutes on the phone with our receptionist talking about what an unfit mother I was. My boss said she was supportive and not concerned about my job, but that she needed to know what was going on. I sat in my car in the parking lot and explained the whole situation while feeling completely humiliated. My boss listened and said she'd talk to the receptionist about screening calls better. I went inside and tried to focus on spreadsheets but kept making mistakes. That afternoon, we took Oliver to his first real session with Adriana. Craig and I sat in the waiting room for an hour while she worked with him. When the door opened, Adriana asked us to come to her office without Oliver, who was still playing. She sat down and told us Oliver was very confused about why he couldn't see Grandma anymore. She said he'd repeated several of Janet's phrases during play therapy, including calling me the witch who took Daddy away. Hearing those words from Adriana's mouth made my chest hurt. She said this was normal and that we shouldn't be discouraged because Oliver was already starting to question some of what Janet had taught him. We drove home and I couldn't stop thinking about my baby calling me a witch to a stranger. That evening, Lauren showed up at our door with her husband. She hugged me right away and apologized for not saying something sooner about Janet's weird behavior with Oliver. She said she'd thought it was just typical grandmother spoiling until everything exploded at Thanksgiving. Lauren told us she'd been reviewing the videos on her phone and found even more concerning things she hadn't noticed before. Her husband said Janet had always made him uncomfortable, but he'd never known why until now. They stayed for dinner and helped us put Oliver to bed. The next few days, we started interviewing daycares because I needed to get back to work, and we couldn't trust Janet anymore. We visited 5 different facilities, and Oliver cried at every single one. He kept saying he wanted Grandma to watch him and asking why she couldn't come to our house. At the 3rd daycare, I had to step outside because I felt so guilty for not recognizing Janet's manipulation before it got this deep into Oliver's mind. Craig found me in the parking lot and reminded me this wasn't my fault, but it felt like my fault for leaving my son with someone who spent months teaching him to hate me. We tried to settle into some kind of normal routine, but 2 days later, Robert called while I was making lunch. His voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. He told us Janet had hired a lawyer that morning and planned to file for grandparent visitation rights by the end of the week. Craig put the phone on speaker, and we both listened to Robert explain that Janet was convinced she had a strong case because she'd been Oliver's primary caregiver 3 days a week. Robert went quiet for a minute and then admitted he was thinking about separation because watching Janet play the victim while destroying our family was more than he could handle anymore. Craig asked his dad if he was serious, and Robert said yes, that after 40 years of marriage, he finally understood his wife was willing to hurt their grandson to punish me for setting boundaries. We hung up, and Craig sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, while Oliver played with blocks in the living room. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. Craig signed for it, and we opened it together at the kitchen table. Janet's lawyer had sent a formal letter on expensive letterhead demanding we allow supervised visits while the case proceeded through court. The letter claimed Oliver had an established relationship with his grandmother, and that denying contact would harm him emotionally. I felt sick reading the words because they twisted everything to make Janet sound like a loving grandmother being kept from her grandchild by cruel parents. Craig called Isaac immediately, and we drove to his office that afternoon while Lauren watched Oliver. Isaac read the letter carefully, and then told us to refuse any contact and let the judge decide. He explained that any visits now could be used to establish a relationship pattern that would benefit Janet's case because her lawyer would argue we'd allowed contact during the legal proceedings. Craig wanted to know if refusing would make us look bad to a judge, but Isaac said no, that we had documented evidence of parental alienation and needed to protect Oliver from further manipulation while the case moved forward. That night, Oliver had a complete breakdown at bedtime. He started crying when I tried to tuck him in, and then he was screaming that he hated me and wanted to live with Grandma. Craig came running from the bathroom and picked Oliver up, but our son kept screaming and hitting Craig's chest with his little fists. Craig held him tight and rocked him while Oliver sobbed about wanting Grandma and asking why we were being mean to her. I stood in the doorway watching my baby cry for the woman who'd spent months teaching him to reject me, and I couldn't breathe. Craig looked at me over Oliver's head, and I saw tears on his face too. I turned and walked out of the room because I couldn't let Oliver see me break down. I went to our bedroom and closed the door and sat on the floor with my back against the bed. I could still hear Oliver crying down the hall, and every scream felt like proof that Janet had won. She'd gotten so deep into his head that even without seeing her for weeks, he still wanted her more than me. The next morning, I sent Adriana an email describing Oliver's meltdown in detail. She called me back within 2 hours while I was folding laundry. She explained that what Oliver was experiencing was completely normal regression in parental alienation cases. She said Oliver was grieving the loss of what felt like unconditional love from Janet, even though that love was actually manipulation wrapped in treats and toys. Adriana told me that children Oliver's age can't understand why someone who was nice to them suddenly isn't allowed around anymore. She said he was experiencing real loss even though what he lost was toxic. I asked her if Oliver would ever get better, and she promised me that with consistent therapy and stable parenting, he would eventually understand the truth. She scheduled an extra session for that week and told me to document every meltdown, because the court would need to see evidence of the damage Janet had caused. I went back to work part-time the following Monday because we needed the income, and I needed something to focus on besides my son thinking I was evil. I sat at my desk trying to review spreadsheets, but the numbers kept blurring together. My coworker in the next cubicle asked if I was okay, and I lied and said I was fine. At lunch, I went to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall and cried as quietly as I could. When I came out, my coworker was washing her hands and she saw my face in the mirror. She asked again if I was okay and offered to buy me coffee. I was too embarrassed to explain that my mother-in-law had been running a campaign to turn my son against me, so I thanked her and said I was dealing with some family stuff. She hugged me and told me she was there if I needed to talk. I went back to my desk and forced myself to focus on accounts payable until 5 o'clock. Craig started individual therapy that week with a counselor who specialized in toxic family systems. Isaac had recommended her after reviewing our case. Craig came home from his first session and went straight to the bedroom without saying much. I found him sitting on the edge of the bed staring at the wall. I asked how it went, and he was quiet for a long time before answering. He finally told me the therapist had helped him see how much of his childhood was actually emotional abuse that he'd normalized. He said she'd asked him questions about his mother's behavior when he was young, and he'd started realizing that the abandonment during law school wasn't an isolated incident. Janet had always put her needs first and made Craig feel guilty for having needs of his own. He said the therapist told him that his normal meter was broken because he'd spent 35 years learning to accept unacceptable behavior as love. I sat next to him and put my hand on his knee, and we stayed like that for a while without talking. We spent the next week visiting daycares because Oliver needed consistent care, and I had to work. The 5th place we toured had an opening, and the director sat down with us in her office to discuss our situation. We explained that we needed documentation of Oliver's adjustment and any concerning statements he might make. The director nodded and said she'd seen parental alienation cases before and knew how to handle the situation professionally. She showed us their incident report system and explained that teachers documented any unusual behavior or statements from children. She said they could provide weekly summaries for our lawyer if needed. Craig asked about their background check process for staff, and the director walked us through their safety protocols. We enrolled Oliver to start the following Monday, and I felt relieved to finally have professional childcare from people who understood what we were dealing with. Oliver's second session with Adriana went better than the first. Craig and I waited in the lobby while she worked with him for an hour. When she brought him out, he was smiling and holding a drawing he'd made. Adriana asked us to come to her office and explained that she'd used play therapy to help Oliver understand that people who really love us don't ask us to hate other people we love. She said it was a simple concept, but Oliver had processed it through his toy figures in a way that seemed to click. She showed us how he'd acted out a scene where one toy told another toy to stop being friends with a third toy, and then Oliver had made the first toy apologize. Adriana said this was a breakthrough moment where Oliver was starting to recognize that Janet's coaching wasn't actually loving behavior. I watched Oliver color at the small table in her office and felt hopeful for the first time in weeks. That hope lasted exactly 4 days until Janet showed up at our house unannounced on Saturday morning. Craig was in the kitchen making breakfast, and I was helping Oliver get dressed when the doorbell rang. Craig looked through the peephole and his whole body went rigid. He opened the door but stood in the doorway blocking the entrance. I heard Janet's voice demanding to see her grandson and Craig telling her she needed to leave. I came down the stairs and saw Janet trying to push past Craig into our house. She was yelling that she had rights and we couldn't keep her away from Oliver. Craig physically blocked her with his arm across the doorframe while I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Janet saw me calling and started crying loudly about being kept from her grandchild. The police arrived within 10 minutes and found Janet still standing on our porch crying while Craig blocked the door. 2 officers got out of the patrol car and walked up our driveway. The older officer asked Janet to step away from the door, and she immediately switched into victim mode. She told them through tears that we were keeping her from seeing her grandson, who she'd raised while I worked. She said she was a devoted grandmother being punished for loving her grandchild too much. The younger officer asked Craig for our side, and he calmly explained that Janet was subject to a legal process regarding visitation rights and had been told by lawyers to stay away until the court decided. The older officer asked if we had documentation, and I showed him Isaac's letter and the certified mail receipt from Janet's lawyer. The officers looked at each other, and then the older one turned to Janet and explained that she needed to leave immediately and follow the legal process. Janet started crying harder and saying this was cruel and unfair. The officers stayed professional and walked her to her car while the younger one took notes for their report. They told us they'd document the incident and give us a copy for our records. Janet drove away slowly while staring at our house, and I locked the door the second her car turned the corner. I met with Isaac at his office 3 days after the police report was filed. He had copies of everything spread across his desk, including the incident report, and Lauren's videos and Adriana's notes from Oliver's first 2 sessions. Isaac leaned back in his chair looking satisfied as he reviewed the police documentation. He explained that Janet showing up at our house after receiving legal notice to stay away showed a clear pattern of boundary violations that would hurt her case significantly. The judge would see this as evidence she couldn't follow basic rules, which raised serious questions about her ability to respect court orders. Isaac had already started putting together our response to Janet's petition, and he showed me the draft, which included all the documentation we'd gathered. He pointed to specific sections where he referenced the coaching videos and Adriana's professional assessment of Oliver's statements. Isaac said we had a strong case for denying any unsupervised visitation, and he believed the judge would see Janet's behavior as harmful manipulation rather than normal grandparent affection. I felt relieved hearing him say this because the past weeks had made me doubt whether anyone would believe how bad Janet's actions really were. Isaac filed our response that afternoon and sent copies to Janet's lawyer along with a clear message that we had substantial evidence of parental alienation. Oliver started at his new daycare the following Monday, and I walked him to his classroom feeling nervous about how he'd adjust. The director, Mrs. Coleman, met us at the door, and she'd already been briefed about our situation with Janet. She knelt down to Oliver's level and showed him the toy area and the reading corner while I filled out the last of the paperwork. Oliver seemed excited about the new toys but kept asking if Grandma would pick him up later. I had to explain again that his teachers would be taking care of him now and Daddy or I would do pickup. Mrs. Coleman called me 2 days later to give an update on Oliver's adjustment. She said he was doing well overall and playing nicely with the other kids, but she needed to document something concerning. Oliver had told another child during snack time that his mama was mean and didn't love him. The teacher had overheard and gently corrected Oliver by asking him if his mama gave him hugs and made him meals and took care of him. Oliver had looked confused and said yes, but Grandma said mama was mean. The teacher documented the exact conversation, and Mrs. Coleman assured me this kind of evidence would be valuable for our court case. She said the staff would continue to gently correct these statements whenever Oliver repeated them and keep detailed records of everything. I thanked her and hung up feeling sick that Janet's words were still coming out of my son's mouth even after weeks of no contact. Craig's Aunt Natasha called that evening while I was making dinner. She sounded upset as she explained that Janet had been calling various family members over the past week, trying to build support for her side of the story. Natasha said Janet was telling people that we were cruel and vindictive for keeping Oliver away from his loving grandmother. Some relatives who hadn't been at Thanksgiving were believing Janet's version where she was the innocent victim being punished for caring too much. Natasha warned us that several family members were now taking Janet's side, and Thanksgiving next year would be extremely complicated. She mentioned that Craig's cousin Michelle and his Aunt Dorothy both believed Janet's claims that we were overreacting to normal grandmother behavior. Natasha said she'd tried to explain about the videos and the coaching, but these relatives thought we were exaggerating or taking things out of context. I felt frustrated that Janet was successfully manipulating family members who hadn't witnessed the Thanksgiving incident firsthand. Craig overheard part of the conversation and asked to speak to Natasha himself. He spent 20 minutes on the phone with her getting details about which relatives were supporting Janet and what exactly she was telling them. When he hung up, his face was red, and he punched the kitchen counter hard enough to hurt his hand. The tension between Craig and me had been building for days, and finally came to a head that weekend. We were both exhausted from the stress and started snapping at each other over small things like dishes and Oliver's bedtime routine. Craig felt guilty for exposing Oliver to his mother, and kept saying he should have seen the signs sooner. I was struggling with resentment that he hadn't recognized Janet's toxicity, despite his own childhood experience of her abandonment. We had a fight Saturday night after Oliver went to bed, where I said things I regretted about Craig being blind to his mother's manipulation. He fired back that I should have told him sooner that I was uncomfortable with how much time Janet spent with Oliver. We both knew we needed help, so Craig called a marriage counselor his therapist had recommended. We got an appointment for the following Tuesday, and spent the days until then being carefully polite to each other. The marriage counselor, Dr. Reynolds, had an office in a medical building downtown, and we sat on opposite ends of her couch during our first session. She asked us to explain what brought us in, and we both started talking at once, then stopped and gestured for the other to go first. Craig explained the situation with his mother and Oliver while I sat there picking at my fingernails. Dr. Reynolds listened without interrupting, and then asked each of us how we felt about the other's role in what happened. I admitted I blamed Craig for not seeing his mother's behavior patterns sooner, and he said he felt like I was punishing him for his mother's actions. Dr. Reynolds helped us understand that we were both victims of Janet's manipulation, and needed to be on the same team instead of turning on each other. She explained that Craig's childhood abandonment had trained him to accept Janet's behavior as normal and seek her approval even when she was being harmful. Craig started crying as he acknowledged that he'd enabled his mother's access to Oliver because he was subconsciously still trying to make her love him the way she hadn't when he was young. I moved closer on the couch and held his hand while he talked about feeling like he'd failed to protect our son the same way his father had failed to protect him from Janet's abandonment. Dr. Reynolds gave us tools for communicating without blame and scheduled weekly sessions to work through the damage Janet's manipulation had caused to our marriage. Oliver had his next therapy session with Adriana that Thursday, and something shifted during their time together. Adriana called us into her office afterward and explained that Oliver had a breakthrough moment. He'd been playing with toy figures and acting out different scenarios when he suddenly told Adriana that he missed Grandma but didn't want Mama to go away. It was the first time he'd expressed wanting both relationships, instead of repeating Janet's either-or programming about choosing between us. Adriana showed us the notes she'd taken during the session where Oliver had said he loved Grandma and loved Mama and didn't understand why he couldn't see both of them. She explained this was huge progress because it showed Oliver was starting to separate from the toxic messaging that loving one person meant hating another. Oliver had asked Adriana why Grandma told him Mama was bad if Mama gives him hugs and makes him breakfast. Adriana said she'd gently helped Oliver understand that sometimes people say things that aren't true when they're upset or want something. Oliver was beginning to question the things Janet had taught him instead of just accepting them as facts. I felt hopeful for the first time in weeks that maybe we could undo some of the damage Janet had caused. Robert called Craig the next day with news that made everything feel more real and permanent. He'd filed for legal separation from Janet and was moving into his own apartment. Craig was devastated even though he completely supported his father's decision. Robert explained over speakerphone that he couldn't stay married to someone who would deliberately harm their grandchild to punish their daughter-in-law. He said he'd spent 40 years making excuses for Janet's behavior, and he was done enabling her to hurt the people he loved. Robert's voice cracked as he told Craig that choosing to leave Janet was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but staying would mean being complicit in her continued manipulation. Craig asked if there was any chance they could work it out, and Robert said not, unless Janet acknowledged what she'd done and got serious help, which he knew would never happen. Robert promised he'd still be in Oliver's life as much as we wanted, and that leaving Janet didn't mean leaving his son and grandson. After the call ended, Craig sat on the couch staring at nothing for over an hour. I knew he was processing the reality that his mother's actions had destroyed his parents' marriage on top of everything else she'd damaged. Isaac called 2 weeks later with an update that Janet's lawyer had requested mediation before the court hearing. Isaac said this was actually a good sign because it meant they knew their case was weak and wanted to avoid going in front of a judge. We agreed to mediation, though. Isaac warned us that Janet likely wouldn't accept any outcome that didn't give her regular, unsupervised access to Oliver. He spent an hour preparing us for what to expect in the mediation session, and coaching us on how to stay calm when Janet tried to manipulate the mediator. Isaac said the key was presenting facts and documentation rather than getting emotional, even though Janet would almost certainly cry and play victim. We scheduled the mediation for the following week at a neutral location downtown. The mediation session took place in a small conference room with a court-appointed mediator named Ms. Rivera. Janet arrived with her lawyer looking like she'd been crying for days with red eyes and tissues in her hand. We sat on opposite sides of the table and Ms. Rivera explained the mediation process and ground rules. Janet immediately started crying and talking about how much she loved Oliver and how cruel it was to keep them apart. She insisted she'd only ever tried to protect Oliver from my neglect as a working mother, who prioritized career over family. The mediator asked Janet to explain what specific neglect she'd witnessed, and Janet's answers were vague and contradictory. Ms. Rivera then asked to review the evidence Isaac had provided, and we watched Janet's face change as the videos played on the laptop. Each clip showed Janet coaching Oliver with treats and toys to say horrible things about me. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat and kept glancing at Janet like he was seeing her differently. The mediator watched all 12 videos without expression, then asked Janet to explain what we were seeing. Janet tried to claim the videos were taken out of context and that she was just playing pretend games with Oliver. Ms. Rivera pointed out that the timestamps showed systematic coaching over weeks and asked how that qualified as pretend play. Janet's lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted against his client. Ms. Rivera suggested a compromise where Janet could have supervised visits once monthly at a neutral location with a court-approved monitor. Janet's face went red and she refused, immediately saying she deserved weekly unsupervised time with her grandson. Her lawyer tried to convince her to accept the compromise, explaining quietly that this was likely better than what a judge would order. Janet stood up and said she wouldn't accept being treated like a criminal when she'd done nothing wrong. She insisted that any judge would see she was a devoted grandmother being punished for loving too much. Her lawyer put his hand on her arm, trying to get her to sit back down, but Janet pulled away. She looked at me across the table and said I'd regret keeping Oliver from her, and that the truth would come out in court. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the conference room, leaving her lawyer apologizing to Ms. Rivera. The mediator marked the session as failed and said we'd proceed to the court hearing where a judge would make the final decision about Janet's visitation rights. 3 weeks later, the daycare director called me at work to say she needed to discuss something Oliver had said that morning. My stomach dropped as I drove to the facility, thinking Janet had somehow gotten to him despite our strict instructions. The director met me in her office and explained that Oliver had told his teacher he wasn't allowed to see Grandma because Mama was mean. The teacher had gently asked Oliver who told him that, and he'd thought for a long minute before answering that Grandma did. Then his face had gotten confused, like he was realizing something didn't make sense about what he'd just said. The director showed me the notes the teacher had written and said this was actually a positive sign that Oliver was starting to question the things Janet had taught him. She explained that children his age were developing critical thinking skills, and Oliver was beginning to recognize the difference between what he'd been told and what he actually experienced. I felt relief mixed with sadness that my 4-year-old had to work through this kind of manipulation at all. The director assured me they were documenting everything and would continue supporting Oliver's emotional development through the transition. That afternoon, I had a scheduled call with Adriana to discuss Oliver's progress in therapy. She reported that Oliver was making significant steps forward in understanding that Grandma had taught him things that weren't true. He was starting to separate his own feelings from the scripts Janet had given him during those babysitting sessions. Adriana explained that Oliver still had moments of confusion and regression, which was completely normal for a child processing parental alienation. She'd been using play therapy to help him work through the conflicting messages about me and his natural attachment to both his parents. During their last session, Oliver had built a house with blocks and put toy figures representing our family inside together. When Adriana had asked about Grandma, he'd put that figure outside the house and said she had to stay there because she'd been mean to Mama. Then he'd gotten quiet and moved the Grandma figure a little closer, saying maybe she could visit sometimes if she was nice. Adriana said this showed Oliver was developing his own understanding of the situation, rather than just repeating what adults told him. She wanted to continue weekly sessions for another month before reducing to twice monthly. 2 days later, Craig's phone rang while we were making dinner, and he put it on speaker when he saw it was Roman calling. Roman's voice was tight as he explained he'd just finished testifying in a deposition about Janet's abandonment of Craig during law school. The lawyers had asked detailed questions about Craig's emotional state as a child, and Roman had provided specific examples of how devastated Craig had been when Janet left. He described finding 8-year-old Craig crying in his room, asking why his mama didn't want to live with him anymore. He'd talked about the birthday parties Janet missed and the school events where Craig would scan the audience looking for her face. Roman said the lawyers seemed very interested in Janet's pattern of prioritizing herself over family relationships and how that connected to her current behavior with Oliver. He apologized for having to share those painful memories in a legal setting, but said he felt it was important for the judge to understand Janet's history. Craig thanked him and hung up, looking drained from hearing his childhood trauma discussed as evidence in a court case. Oliver's 4th birthday arrived on a Saturday, and we kept the celebration small with just a few kids from daycare and Craig's dad. We decorated the living room with blue and green balloons because Oliver was obsessed with dinosaurs lately. He ran around playing with his new toys and eating cake and didn't mention Grandma once during the whole party. I watched him laughing with his friends and felt grateful that he was having a normal happy birthday without Janet's shadow over it. Robert stayed to help clean up after the other families left, and Oliver showed him every single present in great detail. Later that night, after Oliver's bath and bedtime story, he looked up at me with serious eyes. He asked if Grandma had forgotten his birthday, and I saw genuine hurt there that broke my heart into pieces. I explained that Grandma knew about his birthday, but wasn't able to come to the party right now. Oliver nodded slowly and said he missed her sometimes, even though she'd been mean. I told him it was okay to miss people, and that his feelings were always valid no matter what. He fell asleep holding the stuffed dinosaur Robert had given him, and I sat on his bedroom floor crying quietly for several minutes. The next morning, Isaac called to tell us the court hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away. He felt confident based on the evidence we'd compiled and Janet's refusal to compromise in mediation. The videos from Lauren combined with Adriana's professional assessment and Roman's deposition created a strong case for limiting Janet's access to Oliver. Isaac warned us that judges sometimes granted limited supervised visitation to grandparents, even in cases of proven manipulation. He said we should prepare mentally for the possibility that Janet might get monthly supervised visits at a neutral location. Craig asked what would happen if Janet violated whatever the judge ordered, and Isaac explained that contempt of court charges could result in fines or even jail time. We spent the rest of the call going over what to expect during the hearing and how to present ourselves to the judge. 3 days before the hearing, Craig got a call from his cousin who still talked to Janet occasionally. The cousin warned us that Janet was planning to bring several family members to court to testify about what a devoted grandmother she'd been to Oliver. She'd apparently been calling relatives for weeks, building her case and painting herself as the victim of our cruelty. We weren't surprised, but it was painful knowing some family members were choosing to support Janet's manipulation, despite all the evidence. Craig asked which relatives were testifying for her, and his cousin named 4 people, including Janet's sister and 2 of Craig's distant cousins. The cousin apologized for not being able to convince them to stay neutral and said family gatherings were going to be awkward for years after this. That evening, Lauren came over looking nervous and exhausted. She'd been avoiding talking to Janet since the mediation, but their mother had been leaving increasingly angry voicemails. Lauren told us she'd agreed to testify about the videos and Janet's behavior despite knowing it would permanently damage their relationship. She showed us a text from Janet calling her a traitor and saying she'd regret choosing my side over her own mother. Craig hugged his sister and said he was grateful, but felt guilty that she had to choose sides in such a public way. Lauren cried and said she couldn't stay silent when Janet was actively harming a child, even if that child was her nephew. She'd made copies of all 12 videos and written a detailed statement about the context of each one for the court. The next day, Oliver had what Adriana called a regression episode during his therapy session. He'd been doing well all week, but suddenly refused to participate in their activities and asked to go home. When I picked him up, he wouldn't look at me and climbed into his car seat without the usual hug. At home, he played quietly by himself, and when I tried to sit with him, he moved away. That night at bedtime, he said he wanted Grandma to read him stories instead of me. I felt devastated watching my son pull away, but called Adriana, who reminded me this was normal and didn't erase all his progress. She explained that Oliver was processing complicated emotions, and sometimes that meant taking steps backward before moving forward again. She suggested giving him space while maintaining our normal routines and showing him consistent love even when he was rejected it. Craig took over bedtime that night, and I heard Oliver asking him why Grandma couldn't come back if she promised to be nice. The night before court, Craig and I stayed up past midnight talking through every possible outcome. We agreed that any visitation with Janet needed to be supervised by a professional monitor and kept to once monthly at most. Craig said he'd appeal if the judge ordered anything more permissive than that, because Oliver's well-being was more important than Janet's feelings. I worried about the family members testifying for Janet and how their statements might influence the judge. Craig reminded me that we had professional assessments from Adriana and documented evidence from Lauren's videos. We finally fell asleep around 2 in the morning, holding hands and trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. The courthouse parking lot was already filling up when we arrived the next morning with Isaac. Janet stood near the entrance with 4 family members clustered around her, looking supportive and concerned. She'd dressed in a conservative navy suit with pearls and had styled her hair simply. She was playing the role of devoted grandmother perfectly with sad eyes and a tired smile. When she saw us, she touched her lawyer's arm and whispered something that made him nod seriously. I watched her arrange her face into an expression of wounded dignity and saw the calculation behind her eyes as she looked at Oliver holding Craig's hand between us. Inside the courtroom, I sat between Craig and Isaac, while Janet's lawyer stood up to make his opening argument. He described Janet as a devoted grandmother who'd been unfairly cut off from her grandson after years of providing loving care. The judge listened without expression while taking notes. Isaac stood next and explained how Janet had systematically coached Oliver to reject me through months of manipulation disguised as babysitting. He played 2 of Lauren's videos on a screen the bailiff set up, and I watched the judge's face change as he saw Janet bribing Oliver with cookies to say I didn't love him. Janet's lawyer objected that the videos were edited or taken out of context, but Isaac had timestamps and metadata proving they were authentic recordings from Janet's own phone that she'd sent to Lauren thinking they were funny. The judge asked to see all 12 videos, so we spent 40 minutes watching Janet teach my son to hate me in her cheerful grandmother voice, while rewarding him with treats and toys. Lauren testified next about receiving the videos and initially thinking they were harmless grandmother bragging, until she noticed the pattern of coaching Oliver to say increasingly awful things about me. She explained that Janet had texted her multiple times asking if the videos were cute, and if Lauren thought Oliver was smart for remembering all his lines. Janet's lawyer tried to suggest Lauren was testifying out of loyalty to me rather than concern for Oliver. But Lauren stayed calm and said she'd known me for 5 years, and watched me be a good mother the entire time, while her own mother had abandoned Craig for 3 years when he was young. Robert testified about Janet's history of prioritizing herself over family, and his growing concern when Oliver started coming home from Janet's house with new negative phrases about me. He described finding the German fairy tale book at Janet's house with the evil stepmother witch story and realizing she'd been reading it to Oliver multiple times per week. Janet's lawyer asked Robert if he was testifying against his wife because of marital problems, and Robert said no. He was testifying because his wife had harmed their grandson, and someone needed to tell the truth. Adriana took the stand after lunch and explained her assessment of Oliver's psychological state when we started therapy. She described clear signs of parental alienation, including scripted phrases that didn't match Oliver's normal speech patterns, and his confusion when asked to explain why he thought I was mean. She testified that Oliver would repeat Janet's exact words, but couldn't give his own reasons for his feelings, which indicated coaching rather than genuine emotional response. The judge asked specific questions about Oliver's progress in therapy, and whether Adriana believed the damage could be reversed with appropriate intervention. Adriana said yes, children Oliver's age were resilient and could recover from parental alienation if the coaching stopped, and he received consistent therapeutic support, but continued contact with Janet without supervision would undermine all his progress. Janet's lawyer tried to argue that maybe Oliver genuinely preferred his grandmother because I worked instead of staying home, but Adriana calmly explained that 3-year-olds don't naturally care about their mother's employment status unless an adult teaches them to care. She said Oliver's statements about working mothers and witches were clearly adult concepts he'd memorized without understanding them. Janet testified in her own defense, and the performance was exactly what I expected. She cried while describing how much she loved Oliver and claimed she'd only ever tried to give him extra attention because she worried I was too busy with work to properly bond with him. She insisted the videos showed normal grandmother-grandchild interactions and that Lauren had misunderstood her intentions. The judge asked her directly why she'd coached Oliver to call me a witch and say I didn't love him, and Janet said she never used those exact words, that Oliver must have misunderstood the fairy tale book or mixed up the story with reality. Isaac stood up during cross-examination and asked Janet to explain why she'd texted Lauren that the videos were funny if she thought Oliver was genuinely expressing his own feelings. Janet stumbled and said she'd meant it was funny how children's imaginations work, not that she found it funny he was saying mean things about me. Isaac asked her about the promises of puppies and special rooms at her house, and Janet admitted she'd told Oliver those things, but claimed it was just fantasy play, not actual bribes to reject his mother. The judge called a 30-minute recess after Janet's testimony, and Isaac told us he thought things were going well, because Janet's explanations sounded defensive and inconsistent. Craig squeezed my hand and said he couldn't believe his mother was still lying even under oath. We sat in the hallway while Janet stood at the other end surrounded by her 4 family members who'd come to support her. She kept glancing over at us with this wounded expression like we were the ones who'd done something wrong. When court resumed, the judge said he'd reviewed all the evidence including the videos, testimony, and Adriana's psychological assessment. He stated clearly that the videos showed deliberate coaching and manipulation, not innocent grandmother behavior. He said Janet's pattern of behavior constituted parental alienation and posed a serious risk to Oliver's psychological well-being and his relationship with me. The judge denied Janet's petition for regular unsupervised visitation rights. He ordered that any contact between Janet and Oliver must be supervised by a court-approved monitor at a neutral family services center. Visits would be limited to once monthly for 2 hours maximum, and Janet would be required to complete a parenting education program about appropriate grandparent boundaries before visits could begin. He said if Janet violated the order or showed any signs of continued manipulation during supervised visits, he would terminate her visitation rights entirely. Janet started crying immediately, and her lawyer put his hand on her arm trying to calm her down. Robert sat in the row behind us looking relieved but sad, like he was glad Oliver was protected, but heartbroken that his wife had made this necessary. Craig squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, and I felt this huge weight lift off my chest. Months of stress and fear and anger just released all at once, and I had to focus on breathing normally, so I wouldn't start crying in the courtroom. We left through a side exit to avoid Janet and her supporters in the main hallway. Isaac walked with us to the parking garage explaining that Janet had 30 days to file an appeal, but given the strength of our evidence, another judge was unlikely to overturn the ruling. He said the most important thing now was to document everything if Janet tried to contact us outside the supervised visits, because judges took violations of custody orders very seriously in family cases. He advised us to keep detailed records of Oliver's therapy progress, and any statements he made about wanting to see Janet, or repeating her old coaching phrases. Craig thanked Isaac and shook his hand, and I felt grateful we'd found a lawyer who actually understood how serious parental alienation was, instead of dismissing it as typical family drama. On the drive home, Craig called his dad to tell him the outcome, and Robert said he was proud of Craig for protecting Oliver, even though it meant standing up to Janet in such a public way. Oliver continued his therapy sessions with Adriana twice a week, and she started reporting consistent progress in his attachment to me and his understanding that Janet had taught him incorrect things. He still mentioned Grandma sometimes, usually when he saw other kids with their grandmothers at the park, or when he found an old toy she'd given him. The difference was he didn't repeat her scripted phrases anymore, or show the same confusion about whether I loved him. Adriana said he was developing age-appropriate emotional responses instead of the coached reactions Janet had drilled into him. She explained that Oliver would probably always remember this period of his life, but with continued therapy and our consistent parenting, he wouldn't carry lasting psychological damage from Janet's manipulation. Craig's individual therapy sessions were helping him process his childhood and recognize patterns he'd unconsciously accepted as normal. His therapist helped him see how Janet's 3-year abandonment when he was young had trained him to excuse her selfish behavior and prioritize her feelings over his own needs. Craig started setting boundaries with extended family members who made excuses for Janet, telling them he appreciated their concern, but wouldn't discuss his mother's behavior or reconsider the court order. He became more confident in his role as Oliver's protector, instead of feeling guilty about limiting Janet's access. His therapist said Craig was breaking generational patterns of dysfunction and giving Oliver a healthier model of family relationships than he'd experienced growing up. 3 months after Thanksgiving, we drove to the Family Services Center for our first supervised visit with Janet. Oliver was excited in the car, asking if Grandma would bring him presents and if she still had the puppy she'd promised. I reminded him that Grandma wasn't allowed to make big promises anymore and that we were just going to visit for a little while. The Family Services Center was a converted house with playrooms and a waiting area where a professional monitor named Barbara met us at the door. She explained she'd be in the room taking notes during the entire visit and that if Janet said anything inappropriate, the visit would end immediately. Janet arrived 10 minutes late wearing a conservative dress and carrying a small gift bag, and I could see her struggling to hide her anger about the supervision requirement. She smiled at Oliver, but her eyes were cold when she looked at me and Craig. The visit happened in a cheerful playroom with toys and books scattered around, while Barbara sat in the corner with her clipboard. Janet tried to act like everything was normal, asking Oliver about daycare and his favorite activities while avoiding any mention of me or our family situation. Oliver showed her drawings he'd made in art class and talked about his new friend Tyler, who liked dinosaurs. Janet praised everything he said, but I noticed her jaw was tight and her hands kept clenching whenever Oliver mentioned something from his life without her. She asked him if he missed coming to her house, and Oliver said yes sometimes, then added that he liked his new daycare because they had better snacks. Janet's smile looked forced as she changed the subject to a story about a bird she'd seen in her garden. Barbara wrote notes the entire time, and I saw Janet glance at her clipboard with obvious frustration about being monitored like a criminal in her own grandson's presence. After the 2-hour visit ended, Oliver hugged Janet goodbye and asked when he could come back. She told him she wasn't sure, that it was up to other people now, and I saw Barbara make a note about that passive-aggressive comment. In the car going home, Oliver asked why Grandma couldn't come to our house anymore like she used to. Craig explained that Grandma had made some mistakes in how she talked about Mama and needed to learn better ways to show love. He said Grandma still loved Oliver, but had to follow special rules now to make sure everyone stayed happy and safe. Oliver accepted this explanation without arguing, and moved on to asking if we could stop for ice cream. I felt relieved that he wasn't upset or confused, just curious about the changes in a normal kid way. Robert finalized his legal separation from Janet 2 weeks after the court hearing and moved into a small apartment across town. He started having regular grandpa time with Oliver every Saturday afternoon, taking him to parks and museums and teaching him to play chess with a simple board he'd bought. Their relationship grew stronger without Janet's interference, and Robert told us he wished he'd stood up to her manipulation years ago, instead of waiting until she'd harmed Oliver. He said seeing Janet coach his grandson to reject his own mother had finally broken through the denial he'd maintained about her toxic behavior throughout their marriage. Oliver loved his special grandpa days and never asked why Grandma wasn't included, seeming to understand instinctively that time with Robert felt different and healthier than visits with Janet had been. Our final marriage counseling session happened on a Wednesday afternoon in early December, and the therapist congratulated us on the progress we'd made over the past 4 months. Craig reached for my hand during the session and I squeezed back, both of us knowing we'd done the hard work to get here. We'd learned to talk about problems when they started instead of letting them build up until someone exploded. The therapist said we were communicating like a real team now, protecting our family together instead of pulling in different directions. Craig had stopped trying to fix everything himself and started asking me what I needed. I'd stopped keeping score of every time he'd enabled his mother and started focusing on how much he'd changed. We left that office knowing we still had work to do, but feeling solid in a way we hadn't been since before Oliver was born. Oliver's last intensive therapy session with Adriana happened 2 days before Christmas, and she told us he was ready to move to monthly check-ins. She showed us her notes documenting how Oliver's attachment to me had become secure and age-appropriate again. He wasn't repeating any of Janet's phrases anymore, wasn't asking why Mama was mean or when Grandma would take him away. Adriana said the parental alienation damage had been caught early enough that Oliver would likely have no long-term effects. She warned us to watch for regression if Janet ever violated the court order, but she was pleased with how far he'd come in 6 months. Oliver hugged her goodbye and asked if he could bring his new dinosaur toy to show her next time. Adriana smiled and said she'd love to see it, and I felt grateful this woman had helped save my relationship with my son. We started planning for Thanksgiving in January because I wanted everything perfect for our first holiday hosting. Robert confirmed he'd come, along with Lauren and her husband. Natasha called to say she wouldn't miss it, and Roman promised to bring his famous sweet potato casserole. Helen was excited to see Oliver and meet the new family traditions we were building. Craig and I made lists of recipes and decorations, planning a celebration that would feel warm and safe without Janet's toxic presence. Oliver helped us pick out a new tablecloth at the store and asked if Grandpa Robert could sit next to him. We said yes, and watched our son's face light up with excitement about the holiday. This Thanksgiving would be different, but it would be ours. Life settled into patterns that felt normal and healthy by late winter. Oliver loved his daycare and came home every day talking about his friends and the projects they made. My boss gave me a promotion to senior accountant with a small raise, and I felt proud of rebuilding my career after everything that had happened. Craig started sleeping better and smiling more, no longer carrying the weight of his mother's manipulation and his childhood trauma. The supervised visits with Janet continued once a month, and she followed the court order without trying to contact us outside those scheduled times. Oliver went to the visits without resistance, but didn't ask about Janet between them anymore. Our family wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but we were safe now. We were building the real relationships we deserved, the ones based on honesty and respect instead of control and fear.